Hey, I
Hey,
think
Iris. Right.
I don't know if it was acting up or not. The sound was coming through a little weird for me, but I'm hoping that the sound went out all right to everybody else. And I want to make sure that I haven't screwed anything up here. I always worry, but it takes a minute for
I
people
think
to.
I have permission tonight to speak. So,
Yeah, no, it's like no, we don't want anything else to go wrong. Welcome. I can tell people are tuning in. If you're here, please put a comment or under the. I know, like if you're on Facebook, it's probably underneath, or and on YouTube, it's to the side. But just say hello. Let us know you're here, and we will. We like to know, people are out there watching. You can post questions. You're welcome to share any insights that you have as we talk. I'm Iris, and I'm here with Paul Nixon. Hello, Heather. And Margot tonight is actually, some of y'all may recall, her brother passed away a couple of months ago, and they're doing his service in Arlington this week, so that's where she's at. Um, yes, Deborah says hi to both of you. Glad to finally see you, Paul. So,
hi,
uh, yeah. Deborah's on the West Coast. She's in Washington State. And she's actually my sister. So I'm always
yeah,
telling stories on her. So anyway, but we're glad to have y'all here. And yeah, so Paul, bless his heart, the 1 week we were going to have him on, it just things went wonky, and we couldn't get him back in a reasonable amount of time, and so we said, okay, we'll have you on another time. And then last week you were under the weather, and so this week with Margot gone, I said it would be ideal if you could join us tonight, and we're so glad that it worked out. And we discussed thoroughly how Paul was going to go out and ask the fairies for permission to do this, so they won't interrupt with our.
thank God. Please help me.
Yeah.
Don't turn me away again.
So we are so glad that you're here, because and I'm not going to take up a lot of time with fancy introductions, but Paul is from Ireland. You were born in Dublin.
That's right.
That's right. Okay.
Little village outside Dublin, about 7 miles.
Okay, and then but spent a lot of time growing up in your grandmother's home, which was kind of across the other side of the island, actually.
It was up in the northwest of Ireland, Sligo.
Yeah.
It's a very, very, very rural setting, very old setting. And so my parents would take.
So, and Paul and I worked together at a community center for artists and such. And so that's how I got to know Paul. And we've kind of stayed in touch over the years. And it's been one of those things where we immediately connected with all our woo-woo stories. And so I knew we had to get Paul on our show. I want to show, first of all, and I'm going to make this full screen, but we can still hear you. So, Paul, tell us, this is your grandmother's home, correct? And that's
It is, yeah.
Okay, and
it's an old-fashioned college that is probably about 300 years old.
Wow.
And my grandparents' ancestry have been in this area since about the 5th century. There's a very rich history within a 20-mile range of my mother's side of the family there. Wow. And so it adds a lot of value to me. But as a young child, my parents would take me there and leave me with my grandparents at the time. for the summer months or for the Christmas holidays. And it was like stepping out of the 20th century into the 18th century. Um, the road narrowed to an ancient mountain track, and I would hear the mumblings of my father as he mumbled under his breath where thorn bushes and briars would score the sides of his car as he attempted to get up to where my grandmother lived. And so they would stay with me for a while, and then, of course, they would leave me with my grandparents. My grandmother absolutely loved having me, and she was a kind of a mystic. She was very attuned to the natural elements. Um, I mean, you really lived alone, almost like a hermit. We had neighbors. They might be a quarter of a mile away, but the world I lived in was a world of supernatural. She was a big believer in the fairy realm, um, a big believer in the spirit realm, and would warn me always to be very, very cautious in how I respected nature. That if you fell out of whack with dealing with nature in a positive way, there would be repercussions. And so it left a very special place in my heart. And now, all these years later, as an artist, I'm starting to rediscover a way to reconnect to that through photography and through some of the artworks that I've been creating. But
Let, in fact, I could just go ahead and show. Let me go back. Some of the artwork that you did before, and I think talking about some of these pictures will help also bring out some of the stories that you talked about. But you said you were like 6 or 7 years old, and you could just wander for miles.
I was I was a free bird. I was allowed to go out and up to the top of the mountain there, or as you come forward from the house, you're actually walking down to about a mile or so to a bog area, which was really beautiful. There was a river there I used to fish as a young kid, and then about 2 miles beyond that, you're at the ocean. So it basically swept down to the ocean. And even when my parents were there was no concern about me as long as I got home for dinner. It was just a very different thought frame. I think we were kind of thrown into the depths of reality at a very young age, and very, very quickly learned to become responsible with that.
Yeah, and I guess you didn't have muggers and stuff walking around in the bog. You had to worry about the fairies.
I never, there's only one time I ever saw someone in the bog, and I'll tell you about that a little in a little while.
Oh, go ahead. We've opened that book. Go ahead and tell us.
Well, my grandmother passed away in 1980, and my mother asked me to stay behind. Her sister was coming over from England, and I had to stay behind for her, and then follow the rest of the family up to Sligo. Um, I had not been to a country wake before, and it was probably one of the most unusual experiences when it came to a funeral. I arrived at the house. It was March. It was sleeting. It was bitterly cold, and the house was packed, and people were walking around drinking beer and having a great old time. Very, very much a celebration of her life. There was nothing mourning. There was no real mourning as to her loss. It was more of a celebration of the 83 years that she lived on this earth. So I find my mother and I ask, "Where's Dad? I've been looking for Dad among everybody else." And she says, "Well, he's out with some of the neighbors and they're digging the grave for the funeral tomorrow." And I'm thinking, like a scene out of Wuthering Heights, someone with a lantern while others are in the grave, while while the sleet is coming down in this cold environment. Well, anyhow, the next day we drive to Sligo Hospital where she's laid out, and there's a long procession of people waiting to see her. And she's in the morgue, and she's laid out on a slab, and so everybody's
Interesting.
invited in.
I mean, very
Everybody's
different
invited in.
than here.
This was, I expected uh, I guess, a funeral company to kind of come in and take care of all this. We were the ones that were taking care of it. So everybody that lined up came in and they kissed her. And I felt, because I loved her so much, that I felt compelled to do the same. And I felt I was kissing a body of wax. It wasn't the person that I remembered, the warmth,
Mm-hmm.
this loving person. It was kind of a little bit chilling. And so when everybody had uh, moved to one side, my father says to me, "All right, Paul," he says, "you grab her by the legs. Peter, you get over there on the other side and grab her other shoulder. And James, you grab her by the head and let's lift her into the coffin." So we ended up lifting her into the coffin and screwing down the lid and carrying it out to the hearse and driving all the way back to a little church that she used to walk to every morning. It was 3 miles each way, right up to her 83 years,
Wow.
crossing fields and streams. And so there was a little service at the church, and then the whole procession pulled up in front of the mountain in a road, a little lower, a main road that was lower to our country road. And it was like the whole procession paused for a few minutes. It was like giving her a last opportunity to gaze on our home before we ended up driving around the mountain to a very ancient graveyard. And so there was a priest and a number of people had gathered. The hole was already arranged, and there was a pile of debris beside it. And as the funeral gets underway, my sister nudges me. Now, she was about 14 at the time. And she says, is that a skeleton over there? And I look over, and there's a skull and there's a pile of bones. And my mother, on hearing this, she says, "That's your grandfather. Now pay attention to the service."
Oh my God.
Very, very, she was very stoic. Yeah. Um, and so the priest heard this and he said, "Hey, Johnny," he says, "throw a coat on them bones over there. They're upsetting the wee lass here." And so Johnny took a coat off. So after the service, we were all called on to lower the coffin into the grave. And once it was settled in place, my father jumped down onto the coffin, took the skull and the bones, and placed it around the head of the coffin. And then we all proceeded to dig to fill in the grave. This was, in effect, a real connection with life and death. I mean, we try to blow death off as something that, I'm not going to worry about it. I don't want to see it. It's out of my mind. When it happens, it happens. But this was a true exposure to what becomes of loved ones. So
Yeah.
I helped my father out of the hole, and we proceed to fill the grave in. And then a great stone is pulled over the grave. It's like a big doorway. It's about 5 or 6 inches thick, and it's about 6.5 feet long by 3.5 or so feet wide. And I've been doing some research on that stone, and I've confirmed that it actually dates back to about the 1500s.
Wow.
So because it's an ancient family plot, we can't expand on that because of other ancient families, and they're all territorial, move over. So
Yeah.
we had to make room, and this was the tradition to break up the coffin. So later that afternoon, after everybody went out, we all went out to lunch, and we were reminiscing on the great days, and what she provided in all our lives. And I decided, now I was 25 at this time, so I decided I would go for a long walk through the bogs, recount the old haunting trails that I used to walk. And I come around this bend. Now it's pretty flat. I can see for miles, but it's a little bit hilly, and there's brush. And I'm following the river, and there's this man, short man, I'd say probably about 5 feet, curly hair. He was tatterly dressed with a rope around his pants, holding up his pants, and he had both hands on a twisted stick. And as I approached him, he says, "You be young Mr. Nixon." And I'm looking at him, he says, "We're so sorry for your grandmother's loss. She'll be sorely missed. She was a great person to the community here. I mean, there was no community except the fairy world. And so I acknowledge him and I thank him, and I walk past him. I didn't know how to react because of the surprise on seeing him. He had a very round face, jovial, wild curly hair. And so when I passed him, I looked back. There was nobody. There was nothing. I could see for miles. There was nobody to be seen. And that has left a strong impression in my mind at that age of 25 compared to the experiences I had when I was like 5 and 10. Um, it almost cemented that reality that there's a parallel world that we live in. That I think, and one of the things I think from my grandmother and what she did to me, she made me very, very sensitive and aware to everything that was around. I
Instead
mean,
of
I used
instead of
to.
squishing those things down, which is what a
Oh
lot of
no,
parents
I used
do.
to follow. I used to follow. I remember the college used to be whitewashed. My grandfather would mix up lime and water and go out with a big brush and paint, so the house would look sparkling white. And then certain times of the year when the weather was really mild, you would get these huge swarms of flying ants that really it turned the whitewash black.
Ah,
And it was for one day. They were gone the next day. They just disappeared. And I used to be fascinated by this. I was fascinated by all living things.
wow. So and so the assumption then is that the short little guy that you met on the road when you were 25 was probably what we would call a leprechaun, correct?
He was something of the sort. I mean, this is out miles into the bog. It's not near a road or anything like that. The only way I knew where I was, I could look back on the mountain, and that was my compass point. No matter where I went or where I roamed, the mountain and the cliffs above our house, just follow my path back to that, and I could find my way home. And
Um,
so,
Let me go back over here because there's an interesting photo. Let me navigate here. Wait a minute, I want to go. I'll come back to it. But this is part of that same mountain, correct?
this is a connection of that mountain. As that mountain continues, it turns into a valley. It's like a 6 mile loop and comes around to the face of this mountain.
Mm.
This mountain is called Ben Bulben. It's a plateau mountain, tabletop mountain.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone that's familiar with the William Butler Yeats, the poet, the Irish poet, uh, he, like myself, as a young child, was inspired by the lore and stories that were told around this mountain. This is considered as a very sacred mountain. And the black shadow that you see there towards the left is known as the fairy door. And Yeats has written about that, where they come out on certain nights and sweep across the land, bringing mischief and just having a good old time. Um,
Wow.
I have a lot. I found with the words of Yeats that we have a lot of connections that are very, very similar. Well, we're both Gemini, even though
Mm.
we were both born years apart. We both came from Dublin as children to Sligo, and we were both inspired by the same folklore and the mysteries of life, I guess you could say. He took it much, much further than I ever did. He really got into mysticism and he got into hallucinogenics because and tarot reading. He wanted to. It evolved from the fairy world into the spirit world for him. But he is famous now as one of Ireland's leading poets. One of I think in 1922 he won a Nobel Prize for literature, and he was instrumental in reviving a lot of the folkloric literature in the country.
Very cool. Now,
So I'm writing a book about that.
yeah, yeah, I think that's fascinating. And I just want to mention again, if you're watching and you have any comments or questions, or you just want to say hello to kind of let us know that you're tuned in. We Margot and I have learned that this group gets quiet when they're really interested. So, but let me go. I know you took while I've got this pulled up. In fact, let me go back a couple. You've combined some photos that you took with some others to make art, right? Kind of.
What I've done is I've gone out and I've taken. Actually, when I go back to Ireland, I'm all the time looking for places
Mm-hmm.
that are mysterious, that look very cool. This was actually around a doorway, this knotted wood. There was actually a wooden door there, and I just thought this would make a very cool setting for a portal, a transition
Mm.
through. So the steps are actually another photograph I took, but then I added the light to kind of add that mystery as you rise up beyond that portal. You're walking into the light.
Ah, I love the combination. I mean, that takes some artistic skill to pull that off because it just looks like you could just walk right in. I mean, it's awesome.
Well, when I started first, it looked more like child's play. I just, but you know what? There was that drive because it's so important to me. I didn't want what my grandmother instilled in me. I didn't want that to be lost just on me. I wanted to be able to provide some way of creating an image
Mm-hmm.
of what she was trying to put across in me. And now I find with Yeats there are poems that he's written about similar. So I'm actually able to combine my imagery with his works, which makes it very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And I should mention again, I know we've mentioned it before when we were planning on having you. You have become quite the accomplished artist. I mean, and I think when you weren't able to join us that first week, I showed your website to people just so they get an idea. I mean, you've done wood sculptures, metal sculptures, paintings, then your photography and
Mm-hmm.
reliefs, and I mean, and then you do some writing, and you've got all this other stuff. I mean, you just really have taken off with the artwork and really made it um, uh, magical. There's no other word for it. Um, I know this is a combination. The woman's head coming out of the water is a sculpture that you did.
Yeah, she is. The cap that she's wearing on her head, she's actually I'm using her as a depiction of a Celtic merrow, which is a type of mermaid. They wore this type of cap that would allow them to walk on land. And so, in doing so, they would seek out a lover, a human lover. And if he was smart enough to hide her cap, then she couldn't return to sea. So he would have her, they would have a family. But she always had that yearning to go back to sea. And those that didn't remove her cap, she would take them to the into the ocean where they drowned. And so it's kind of a tragic. It's almost like a tragic love tale, where um, they were said to be very very beautiful, but they had webbed features between their hands, and of course when the tail changed to feet, they had webbed toes as well. Very very common tales all throughout the west of Ireland about these merrows, but there was always that warning that if you're not careful, there's an impending doom that awaits you because
Sort of
her folk.
like a game of cat and mouse.
Yes,
cat,
yeah, yeah. I
cat
mean,
and mouse.
she- she's. I mean, she's like any woman and any guy. They're looking for love, and love only lasts so long. So she feels this yearning eventually when she gets, when kids start popping out, and she feels she wants to go back home. Very often, those that have their caps or find their caps will actually return to the ocean, leave everybody, kids and all, behind.
Wow. Very cool. Very cool.
So the photograph is actually a gorge in Scotland, and I incorporated the sculpture um, as coming out of the water. The lilies were also added, as
Mm.
were the branch and the crow. The crows in Ireland are always a symbol of death. Um, you visit any graveyard in Ireland, and you'll find thousands and or hundreds of crows where they gather in rooks in the trees around the graveyard. The ancient Celts used to believe that in battle, when they died, they would transition into a crow before moving on to the afterlife.
Interesting.
And there's a whole subject on that too, where
Yeah.
we have a deity called the Morrigan or Morrigu. She's one of the ancient goddesses, and she would incite battles between opposing forces so that she could transform herself into a crow and then bring the remaining crows in to feed on the carnage. And the Celts saw this as a sacred thing, and they would draw and allow the crows to feed because this was kind of the transcendental um, path for those dead warriors to move on into the afterlife.
Wow. I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, yeah. Can't,
Now,
yeah.
the image you've pulled up here, that was
Mm-hmm.
an interesting experience for me. Um, in 2016, I had returned home,
Mm-hmm.
and my family and I, we all got together. We drove to the west of Ireland, and we spent a little time traveling there. And on our way back to Dublin, about halfway, my brother says, "Come on, we'll stop for a picnic." He said, "I know a quiet little place," and he took us off this down this country road, and we pulled into a farmyard that had been long abandoned. And my mother's she's preparing the lunch, and I'm all for exploring. So my brother and I, we go into one of the fields at the back of the house, and in the middle of the field is this tree. And I don't know if you can see on the right side, it almost looks like a witch's face.
Yeah,
You can see the
the little
chin, the mouth.
stripes going across looks like her big nose, right? And then
Yeah,
her chin
yeah,
coming out
yeah,
under it. And
yeah.
then she's got deep
These were
set
very.
eyes.
That's right. Yeah, that was the first thing that caught my eye. Um, these are trees to be feared of. They are. There's a type of fairy that lives in them called, known as the lunatici, or moon fairies. And so the only time they say that's best to cut this wood is at certain cycles of the moon when the fairies leave to worship the moon goddess. Now the farmer who lived here obviously placed this big stone so that when he plowed the field, it wouldn't damage the tree. Again, otherwise reprisals would have occurred. And I don't know whatever befell the family there because the house was abandoned. One of their sheds was open and it was full of antique equipment that I'd say probably from the 40s was all left behind. Old horse-drawn plow, horse-drawn rig, all farming, and there was a gramophone as well, an old gramophone. So they had disappeared. Um, the tree was also sacred to witches. They would use the thorns to pierce their dolls to inflict pain, I guess, on who they wish to hurt. And there's another interesting story in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in Ireland. um, young girls that gave birth to babies out of wedlock. There was such a taboo over that the parents would try to keep it as secret as much as possible. And the baby or the daughter might be whisked off to a convent where she would give birth at the convent. The nuns would take the baby and they would do with the baby as they pleased, whether they put it for adoption. Unfortunately, a lot of tragic stories came out where a lot of these babies were used as a form of slave. Um, some horrible things are starting to show up now where there's a convent in the west of Ireland where they discovered over 800 babies' bodies in the septic tank on the convent.
Oh no.
Um, so it's pretty horrific. But for the farmers or the locals themselves, if the baby died because it was born out of wedlock, it could not be buried in sanctified ground, such as the Catholic Church. And so what they would do, they would go out in the middle of the night and they would look for an ancient church, Christian church, and bury the baby there. Or if they were Catholic, they found a Protestant church, an old Protestant church that was in ruins. They would bury the baby there. And if there was no churches available or local, and they found a blackthorn tree like this, they would bury the baby under the blackthorn tree with the hope that the fairies would care for their child in the afterlife.
Oh.
But the
Oh,
witches, the
that's
witch that you see, it's pretty intense. It's a very sad history when you really delve into it. But the witch aspect of this tree, which fascinated me, is that the particular witch, is a very ancient. Um, oh gosh, what was her name? I've forgotten her name, but she was the one that actually shaped the land when Ireland was formed. And so every now and again, she would melt into a tree and wait for her time to return again. And that's what intrigued
wow.
me about this. Is she in the tree now as she's kind of dormant till the next time she's called forth? But I've never seen anything like this. I've seen trees. They're very ragged. They have beautiful white flowers. But for one to have humanoid features like this was
I
very
mean, it's
interesting.
so obvious. Yeah. I mean, and is that a flower there in the very center, kind of?
Yes, you got a couple
Yeah.
of flowers there. That's about all. Now, all the other blackthorns in Ireland at that time were all in full flower, so who knows? It might be the energy
Wow.
around the tree.
That is so cool. Now, this one was interesting. We were talking a little bit about this one. Go ahead and
Well, when
explore.
I was about 8 years of age, and we have tall grasses that are like rushes.
Hmm.
They're cylinder, they rise up to a point with a little kind of a not a flower but a little cluster um, near the top.
Hmm.
And I was actually hiding behind a cluster of these. I used to enjoy as a kid. I'd go down. Below our house was an ancient tree with a number of holes. And in the evenings, summer evenings, dozens and dozens of rabbits and their young would come out and they'd play and flip around. And this was kind of like a magical tree for me. But then to have that natural element where I could lie there and just enjoy it. And this particular evening, I'm lying there on my stomach, and suddenly I get a jab on my back, and I look around to see who it is. The rabbits all scurried off, and there's this little old wizen-faced woman, and she's dressed all in black. Now, women who lost their husbands, widows, uh, in the 50s and 60s in Ireland at that time, all wore black, and they basically lived alone. And so she asked me what I was doing, and I told her. And I remember she had a pair of glasses that hung on the end of her nose, and her hair was pulled back real tight. and she looked all the more like a witch when I saw her first. That's what I thought. But she turned out to be a very sweet old woman, and she was a friend to my grandmother. And she said, "Would you come with me?" She says, I have eggs I want you to take to your grandmother." So she holds me by the hand, and we're walking up the lane. Now the lane it's it's old stones, gravel. There's grasses in the middle, and the hedgerow comes up overhead. So you're actually walking in a tunnel. And as we get some distance from the field I was lying in, she points to a hole in the hedge, and she says, "We need to go down here." So we turn into this hole, which was like a walkway down the mountain, 20, 30 feet in this dark kind of tunnel. And it opens out into a clearing. And there's chickens aimlessly meandering around, there's pigeons, and there's an old thatched cottage set up against a tall stand of trees. And it's like this secret place I'd never seen, and yet it was right up the lane from where I lived. And so she brought me in. There were two half doors, and she would always keep the lower door closed and the upper door open to let the light in. And there was a family of robins that would take advantage of that, and they would actually fly into her kitchen and eat breadcrumbs off the table. So she'd sit me by the fire, and she'd stoke the fire, and she'd light up the old oil lamp. And I was just charmed to no end, yeah, to be in the company of this woman who knew as much about my grandmother as my grandmother did about the natural elements. But she always talked about trees and the spirits of trees,
Mm-hmm.
and that one could not survive without the other. Um, that if the tree died, then the spirit entity in that tree would also die, or if they died first, then the tree would die. And so I used to visit her several times a week. We didn't have TV, didn't have radio. It was you were out there in the wilds, and this was someone that I enjoyed seeing, and she, I think, enjoyed having the company and to be able
Sure.
to tell her story. So 50 years later, which was just a few years ago, my brother and I are home. We go visit my grandparents' home. My uncle still lives there, and so we decided to take a walk over the lane to see if we could find this hole in the hedge, which had disappeared now. It's all closed in. But we knew approximately where it was. And so we got ourselves cut up and clothes torn a little bit, trying to weave our way through the hedgerow. And we eventually found in the background where the tree is lying up against is the remains of her house.
I
Now we
see.
approached from the outside of the house, and when I came
Mm-hmm.
around to this side, I was completely blown away because here this woman in this secret place, hidden away from everything else, was this tree with a humanoid figure, which is part of the root system, but yet it looks separate from the tree in a very humanoid way, all dressed in green. And I thought of Winnie's stories about these spirits of the trees and how this all came to pass. And it just reinforced in me, or reassured me that there is magic still when you go
It
look
just
for
looks
it.
like somebody fell back across it or
You're
something.
just lying back, yeah, yeah, yeah. They're lying back against it, but it's the same tree.
Wow. Yeah, that is very cool. That is amazing.
I mean, after all, the coincidence of that, after all these years, 50 years, just to find that particular time and to discover that. And I remember walking into what remained of the house. It was so tiny, as an adult now, I can see um, um, at one time it looked like a big house, but as an adult, everything looked so small, and it was hard to believe that I actually spent many hours getting my mind filled with wonderful stories by this wonderful woman.
Well, what's interesting is you mentioned like your grandmother's house, and I'm assuming this woman's house. Your grandmother's house, you said was probably about 200 years old. Is
Yeah,
that
three
right, or
actually,
am I
300. Mhm.
300 years old?
And
And
her,
so
I would
when
imagine
she,
her this woman Winnie, her name is Winnie. Um, Her house is probably of the same age.
so what happens to the property when they died? If no family member, I mean, did their property get sold? Has any? Is there a market for these?
From Oh, there's definitely a market. In her case, I don't know if there are any families still existing, but the that whole area, that clearing that I used to see, had completely filled in. I mean, it was just this wooded area with this little bit of a clearing where I was able to find this and the remains of the house.
Wow. So, I just wondered. I mean, is like, are there people living in your grandmother's place now?
My uncle, my
Ah,
uncle's still there. He's
well,
still
that's
alive
cool.
and well now. He's in his 80s. The house has been modernized. The road has been modernized. That hedgerow that used to grow up over, it's all been cut back now. You can see across the land. It's taken away a lot of the magic uh, from that time as a young boy and how I remember it. I mean, you could be walking the lane, you'd see rabbits play, you'd see the occasional fox or badger. It
Wow.
was just a fun place to be.
Yeah, yeah. Um, okay, so let's look here. Was this one of those combination photos, or was this just what? What about this
This
photo?
is an actual. It's an actual photo. It's the same photo that you showed earlier with the fairy door, which is
Mm-hmm.
directly behind, the castle. The castle was
Ah,
built in the 1800s. Um, Yates is buried to the right of that mountain, and my family's home is on the left side of that mountain.
ah, very
There
interesting.
are there are oh my gosh, the amount of legends and folklore and dating back thousands of years. There are tombs and graves all over that mountain that are between 5 and 7,000 years old. So that all adds to the the richness of that landscape.
Yes,
Um,
very fascinating. I
there's
mean,
on the left side of the mountain as you go into that valley, Ireland, one of Ireland's highest caves are set up, and it's a cave that's called the Cave of Dermot in Grania, and it's a third-century love story where Grania was betrothed to an old king, and at the wedding reception ended up um, putting sleeping potions in everyone's drink but this one young guy that she used to admire, Dermot. He was a warrior he bested everybody at games and in battle, and of course she put a spell on him for him to take her away. And so for years they fled the country where her husband and his men, they were known as the Fina. They were a band of warriors. They would search and search and search for her, or for them both. And eventually, as the years passed, they turned to the king and said, "Look, we can't keep this up. Would you please forgive us?" And he did, but he still had a spiteful notion about the fact that this guy Dermot took his betrothed away from him.
right.
And so he took him on a boar hunt on this mountain, and Dermot, of course, he was gored to death by this boar. And the only thing that could revive him was a sacred spring where the king would bring water from the spring, and it would heal him. But each time he get closer to Dermot with the water in the cups of his hands, he kept remembering of what he did and just let the water fall through. And then by one of his sons, he was threatened death if he didn't give him more. By that time, he was too late. Dermot had
Uh
passed away. So she threw herself from a chariot when the two of them were racing one day. and she died. And it's said now that both of them are buried in that cave. So it's and then there's stories of witches, and I think the cave has like about 7 or 8 different stories through the centuries. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff.
My this question from Deborah: if someone who was not attuned to the stories purchased a piece of property there, such as an American wanting a vacation home, do
And many
you
have.
do you think they would have problems from the supernatural?
I don't think so. I don't think so. The supernatural will, as long as you respect the land, respect the environment, you'll have no issues.
Do you think
It's
they
people
would have
that are,
encounters though? I mean, God, how could you not with all this richness there?
yeah.
I mean,
There's richness and there's also great tragedy. I mean, the famine in the 1840s, the thousands that died there, um, and just going back, I mean, it's there was a famous battle in the 5th century from an Irish saint called Saint Columba. There was a small monastery at the base of the mountain, and he was given an illuminated manuscript to copy. And he was so impressed with this manuscript that he decided to create one for himself. And a spying monk, on seeing what was going on, reported it back to the abbot. And he says, you know, Columba's back there. He's copying what we asked him to copy, so he's making one for himself. So the abbot approached him and told him to bring it forward, and Columba refused. So Columba ended up going before the High King. And the words of the king: to every book its copy, or to every calf its cow, and to every book its copy. So give it up. And Columba refused. And because there was some family histories there between the king and his ancestry, there was a battle at the foothills of the mountain where over 3,000 died. And Columba was he was a missionary. When he realized through his ego and vanity what had occurred, he vanquished himself to Scotland and set up his own monastery. And I think my ancestry, he was the first abbot. In my ancestry, in around the 700s, was the 7th ancestry, or the 7th abbot to take over that monastery. And but he was responsible for setting up one of the launch pads to bring Christianity back into Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, because they spread out from there into France and Italy and set up monasteries there, which essentially revived the Christian faith in Europe, which is kind of interesting. So there's always all these different snippets of history right up to the Civil War in the 1920s. That same cave that we talk about, my grandfather and his father hid out there. They were wanted, but they hit a price on the head. They were wanted by the Black and Tans.
And the Black and Tans are the police, right?
Well, the Black and Tans were, they had served in World War One.
Ah.
And a lot of them were criminals. They all had, they were butchers. I mean, the British Army had no respect for them at all. So to clothe them, the English government gave them police jackets and military pants. So this is where the term Black and Tan came from. And so they would ride around in their own little columns, and causing all kinds of disruptions. And in fact, their cruelty was actually what brought about the treaty in the 1920s. People were so sickened by the barbaric deeds of these Black and Tans and what they did. But my grandfather, he ended up coming down for Christmas Day. He wanted to go to church, that little church that we all stopped by in that earlier tale I told you about my grandmother, and the Black and Tans were waiting for him. And the first thing he received was a rifle butt in the mouth. And he ended up being interred he had jet black hair when he went in, and he had snow white hair 2 years later when he came out. When the treaty in 1922 came out, a very different man, broken man.
They tortured him so
So I
much he
got no
turned gray.
sympathy. Oh, yeah, yeah.
God, that's
But the
horrible.
history there is always the romance of the folklore has always been wonderful, but the history. And it's not just between the English and the Irish, but the Irish and the Irish themselves are no different. Um,
Yeah.
all has to do with power, money, all
And
the
that
natural
every
things that we
conflict.
all strive for in life. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. In fact, just 3 miles away from there in the 1500s, three of the Spanish Armada ships were shipwrecked. And those that managed to get ashore, the English were waiting, and they basically just hung them or slice and dice them as they came forward. So
Gosh.
of the 3,000, I think of the 3,000 that came ashore, there 400 survived. So there's
So
a
they didn't welcome the immigrants, did they?
when you see the
Spanish
Spanish were a
out.
big, yeah, the Spanish were a big threat to the Irish because of their Catholic faith, and so they
Sure.
felt if the Spanish got in with the Irish, that they would become a much more powerful um, foe to deal with. So the best thing to do is just knock it on the head right away, and so they
Golly.
did.
Um, since you're talking about the black and tans a minute ago, you need to relay that ghost story that you told me before we started, where you were working in the bar when you were
Yeah,
about 16.
I was 16. Yeah, there was a little bar, a little over 200 years old. That was about 5 minute walk from my house. It was called the Central because it was set in the middle of the road, so you could actually walk around it. And it was on Main Street in Clondalkin where I lived, and it was mid March. Um, it was there was tremendous wind, and it was raining hard, and I knew, and it was a Monday night, so I knew that it was very likely that we're going to have a very busy night. Um, when you walk into the bar, you actually walk into a main lounge with a dividing wall, which takes you into another lounge, and then through a door, and then another door it'll take you into a corridor where the men's bathrooms are, or the general bathrooms are on the right, but then the men's bar, where all the mill workers would come in and drink, would be on the left. So when you're standing behind the bar, you could see the men's bar right at the end, and you could see this lounge and that lounge, and then at the other end of the bar was a doorway that led into the cellar. So at that age and that time, we were not allowed to operate the till, and so we're waiting. It's very very boring. Nobody. No, it seemed like nobody was coming in, and then two couples suddenly come in, and they go into each of the lounges. And there's myself and another guy by the name of Canis O'Sullivan, and the manager who worked that night was Martin Burke, and he actually started to serve some people that had come in from the mill at the bar. So with all our orders, we arrived at the cash register at the same time. So while Martin is working out our invoices, the door to the end of the bar into the cellar, the handle starts to move back and forth slowly. Now we know that no one can access this bar or this cellar except by coming through the bar. There was no other door out. Um, so whoever it was, it appeared that we got the impression that it was on the other side of the door because the handle started to twist back and forth, calmly at first, and then it started to get a little bit more agitated. And then it got really angry to where the handle was really as if somebody was trying to get the door open, and then suddenly it stopped, and the door creaked open into the basement or into the cellar, and it jammed on the rise of the floor. And so we're waiting. Nobody shows themselves, and so we're waiting for a few minutes, and we're kind of looking at each other. okay, who's going to go and check this out? Not me. Council, not for what I get paid here. So Martin said, well, I'll do the work. He says, and he went down and he checked out everything. There was nothing there. Closed the door. Jim, the owner of the bar, came in later that night. He came in about 11 o'clock, and I overhear Martin saying to him, "It's happened again, Jim." So we're all curious. So we get everything all cleaned up and ready to go home. I said to Jim, I said, I overheard Martin say to you, I said, it's happened again. Is this something that happens frequently? And he says, yes, it's been happening now for a number of years, and it always seems to happen at this time of year. What we discovered with the door can't open by itself inwards because there's a heavy spring that actually keeps it closed. And the whole idea of the spring is to keep that door closed. And the handle that we were looking at, when you twist it, the inside handle doesn't turn, or vice versa. If you twist, they both work independently of each other. So what we were watching was actually something on our side of the door. And it certainly got our attention. I mean, we knew, and you could feel that cold chill as this thing was going on. So they told me that a number of other things had happened over the years, that there is poltergeist activity on the premises. Now the mill workers, I asked them, I asked Jim, I said, any customers, they ever experienced anything like this? And he said, well, we had a number of mill workers that came in after their shift, and as they came in the side entrance, you walk into a little hallway, bathrooms on the right, or on the left rather, and the bars on the right, and then you got a door that takes you into the lounge. And they said the door into the bar directly across from the bathroom, they could hear a big dog, and it kept pulling on chains and snarling and growling. And they said, we're not going in there. So they came in, and they brought up with the other guys. Did you hear the racket going on in the bathroom out there? So they got Jim's attention, and Jim came over. He says, what's the problem? He says, you got some mad dog in the bathroom there. He says, why is it in there? And Jim is, we don't have a dog in that bathroom. And so they all went out. I think there were about 6 or 7, and Jim and one of the other barmen. And each of them went to take hold of the door handle. And they said there was this magnetic vibration that they could feel as they took hold of the handle. But as soon as they gripped the handle, the barking stopped. And they opened the door, and there was nothing there. And when they closed the door shortly after, the dog would start barking again. And each one that experienced, they actually went and put their hands on the handle and felt the same sensation. And they said, "Screw this, we're going back to the alcohol side of the bar."
The poor dog
every year
there's
been reports. There's been different experiences. I mean, they found someone would come into the bathroom. Oh my God! He said, "Your bathroom is disgusting in there. Someone threw up all over." And they get a mop and bucket and go in, and there's nothing. Or one of the most bizarre incidents, I believe, was when Jim went into the cellar to get some chickens. The fridge door was open, and the chickens were all shredded and scattered all over the floor. And there were strange footprints, small footprints in the dusty shelves that led away from the fridge. So they ended up selling out of there. I ended up moving out of there. And actually, when I came to the United States in 1985, I was here almost 20 years. Now, I've been back several times, but on this one occasion, I went back and invited my father, my brother, and my sister. My mother didn't want to come down to a bar across the street from where the other bar was. And the place was packed, and we were looking around to see if we could find a table. And there were 2 tables in the back, like a little alcove in the back. And so we sat down. And I was just about to tell my parents of this experience in the bar when Martin Burke and his wife walk in and sit at the table next to us. And I'm like, oh my God, talk about coincidence. And I said to Martin, I said, I'm just about to tell them, share that story that we experienced 20 years ago. And he looked at me and says, I bet you never forgot that, did you? It's like, he's dead and gone now since. But it was just some very bizarre things occur that we just can't explain. Um,
Well, and to
you
have
have to
so
go
many
along for the ride.
witnesses at one time. Yeah. But you
Yeah,
said that
yeah,
you
there were
said that
four.
they think that was around some guy in the 20s that got chased down by
There was
the.
in the 1919, there was an informer that passed information of someone that the Black and Tans were looking for, and they had actually piled into that bathroom and shot through the bathroom door. He was in one of the stalls, and they just shot through the door, and it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. So they think that may be the subject for the poltergeist activity.
Gosh, sounds
You know,
worse than a Quentin
someone's like,
Tarantino movie. Yeah. um.
well, they were known for that.
Yeah. Well, and if anybody that's watching has questions, please ask away. But um, when you talk when going back to when you were younger and growing up in your grandmother's area, you said she stressed upon you like respect the earth and that sort of thing. Did she did she ever give you any fearful warnings? Like all this bad stuff can happen, or
You know, there were always the warnings of repercussions if you didn't heed those warnings. So I was one of those kids with a stick that never hit a wildflower, just because I knew that that was, something that was in part beautiful to the landscape and should be left as is. I do remember my grandmother taking me out one night. Across the lane, you could look down on the bog, and she would point out what she claimed was will o' the wisp. You could see these hemispherical spears of light drifting over the bog, and there might be five or six, and you could see them quite clearly. And she would say, "All right," says, "Come on in," just because we don't want will o' the wisp taking you away. And the story behind will o' the wisp is that they would lure you into these bogs to where you would sink and disappear forever. But there have been reports where some investigations where people have actually gone in, and these hemispherical spears would respond to their presence. So as they walk towards the balls of light would move away. But then when they turn to come back or leave, the balls of light would follow them. So a lot to be said there. But when you're getting into bogs, um, there's a huge amount of history lying under your feet. The ancient Celts, they believed that when you took a captive, or if you um, had a victory over your enemy, the enemy would then be sacrificed and then buried or placed in these bogs because the bogs have no bacteria. So anything that's placed in there will survive forever. Nothing will ever die. The growth, the vegetation that lives and dies, the next vegetation comes along and it lives on top of it and dies, and it just builds up. You can go back, you can dig down 8 feet, and you're actually going back 8,000 years. So every now and again, they will find um, balls of cheese that might be 3,000 years old. Um, just a couple of years ago, there was a walkway through a bog out to a monastery in the west of Ireland, the ruins of a monastery, and they found all these bodies with their Vikings, with their swords and shields and lances, as well as some of the monastic pillages that they took. Evidently, there was some kind of skirmish on this walkway through the bog that a number of them fell off into the bog. And so now these are all being discovered. And of course, you might have heard there just a few years ago at the time of the Gulf War, which raised a sensation in Ireland. There was a Book of Psalms discovered by a guy operating an earth mover. And the book was written in the 5th century, but it was turned on the page of Armageddon, which is kind of interesting.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
that's, that's been restored at the moment. But when you walk on the ground, it actually bounces. And yet, I remember as a child, my grandfather would go down there. Everybody had a portion that was assigned to their property, and so they had a type of shovel. It was a two-sided shovel that they would slice into the turf, and then slice it again, and you could pick out the sod, and they would be stacked like little teepees, 5, 6, 7 at a time. And when that all dried out, that would become fuel then for the winter months. The most fragrant for anyone that's ever smelt Irish turf or smelt walking the country roads in Ireland. It's just a wonderful. It just leaves a wonderful aroma throughout the countryside. But yeah,
Wow.
that was part of survival now at that time. I actually brought back, which I had featured recently as a sculpture, was a piece of oak that's dated to about 6,000 years. And I found that at a gallery. Family and I, it was a few years back, we were driving through the west of Ireland, or through the central Ireland, and we came across this little art gallery in the middle of nowhere, and it had all these bogwood sculptures. And so I get talking to the gallery owner, and she said, yes, all the local artists, they go to a particular area that's owned by the electricity supply board that distributes electricity to all of Ireland. And they actually use the peat in these bogs to fuel um, their systems. And so when they dig down, um, in this particular case, there were actually 3 different forests growing on top of each other,
God.
and the oldest being between 5.5 to 6,000 years old. And then the climatic conditions changed, where the bog and the peat started to build up, and they'll actually bury the forest, and the ground would then stabilize, and then another forest would grow on top of it, and the same action would repeat itself again. And then finally, about 2,000 years ago, a pine forest would grow. And so these are all perfectly preserved. Artists use them for outdoor water features. You can put them in fish tanks because they're already saturated with the absorbents from the bog, so they'll never deteriorate or never rot. The only way to destroy them is to burn them, which was another way, another means of fuel too for a lot of farmers at that time.
That is fascinating. Now, what made them
So
stop growing? I mean, like, why isn't there a forest on top now?
it's well, you've got so much dampness in Ireland that to really understand the bog, it all depends on the conditions of the climate and how active it starts to grow. And as I say, when it starts to grow, you get, let's say you've got a field full of mosses and lichens, and they die. Then the next generation of mosses and lichens grow on top of that, and it
Ah,
slowly over time starts to build up, and then eventually the ground will settle to where shrubs and then trees start to grow. I've
gotcha.
been told that they actually pull trees out with the leaves still on them, but once the leaves dry, they turn to dust.
That is
They actually
amazing.
have a number. Yeah, they have some bodies actually in the Dublin Museum that date back 2, 3, and 4,000 years, and they describe them as, they've been tortured. Mostly they've been beheaded, but you could tell by their nails that they were well manicured. They they weren't poor savages. I mean, they were established people at the time, and but by burying them in the bog, this was a way of preventing them from moving into the afterlife where they could inflict more harm on the living. This was like a purgatory. You
Oh,
can put them you can put them out of the picture, and there's no consequences. You wouldn't have to worry about it. And that was kind of the mindset at the time. So all
wow.
those little emephary that you see over the pot from time to time, you wonder um, what more could create such things.
That is amazing. Well, Paul, we're over our time here, and you've been very gracious with your stories. I think they're fascinating, and I'll probably bug you again in a couple of months and see if we can get you back and talk about some other stuff and share more art and some of the stuff you've been doing and that kind of thing. But I know you're full
No
of
shortage.
stories. I mean, we didn't even touch on. I remember you telling me some really cool stories about sailing like around the world, basically, and finding
Mhm.
some remote areas and things you encountered there. And so, yeah, we definitely want to pick your brain some more in a couple of months if you're willing to come back.
Of
and,
course, yeah.
and Deborah says,
Look forward to it.
fascinating time. Thank you. You're an amazing storyteller. Yeah, I love. I could
Enjoyed
just listen to Paul all day. So, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And to everybody that tuned in, or if you're watching this later, we're live every Wednesday at 9:30. But you can if you can't find us live, then of course the recordings stay on Facebook and on YouTube. And we've got the Eyes of Indigo page on Facebook, so you can find us there. But hope you'll join us. So thank you very much, Paul. And I guess we'll end it there. Thank you. Eyes of Indigo with
Good
Iris
night, Iris.
Carter
Thank
and
you.
Margot Ross Sears. Music is Arcadia by Kevin MacLeod of Incomptech.com. Licensed under Creative Commons. Music is Arcadia by Kevin MacLeod. Visit our Facebook page for broadcast details. www.facebook.com/Eyes of Indigo. Show is copyrighted 2021 by Iris Carter and Margot Ross Sears. All rights reserved.